On a hot morning, the courtroom is full for another routine hearing. A German shepherd emerges from the side door and walks to the witness stand with a crumpled note clenched in its mouth. In the background, a mature woman, attentive to every step, fixes her eyes on the animal. The judge interrupts the session and orders the paper to be collected. The silence is broken by the sound of the dog's nails on the wooden floor. A court officer takes the document to the prosecutor. He reads a name that was never mentioned in the process. For a second, no one moves. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now, let's get back to our story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps in Millbrook, Indiana, a town where everybody knew everybody and secrets were harder to keep than promises. Inside the century-old brick building, the air was thick with anticipation as townsfolk filled the wooden benches, their whispered conversations creating a low hum that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and surveyed the crowded courtroom. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, the kind that would wrap up before lunch and send everyone back to their daily routines. The case involved a disputed property claim that had been dragging through the courts for months, nothing that should have drawn such attention. Yet here they were, with standing room only, and faces he recognized from the grocery store, the diner, and Sunday service. Margaret Thompson sat in the third row, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. At 62, Maggie had earned respect throughout Millbrook through her tireless volunteer work at the community center and her gentle way of helping neighbors through difficult times. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore her best navy dress, the one she reserved for church and important occasions. But today, unlike other court appearances she had witnessed, her stomach churned with an anxiety she couldn't shake. Across the aisle, Richard Blackwood adjusted his expensive silk tie and smiled cordially at the people around him. At 55, Richard commanded attention wherever he went, his tall frame and perfectly groomed appearance speaking to his success in real estate development. He owned half the commercial properties in Millbrook and had his fingers in every major decision that shaped the town's future. His political connections reached all the way to the state capitol, and his charitable donations kept his name prominently displayed on plaques throughout the community. The bailiff called for order as the proceedings began. Attorney David Chen shuffled his papers at the plaintiff's table while defense lawyer Patricia Wells reviewed her notes one final time. The case seemed straightforward enough. A boundary dispute between two long-time residents that should have been settled years ago. Judge Harrison had presided over similar cases dozens of times, and nothing in the file suggested this would be any different. "We'll begin with opening statements," Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying easily through the silent courtroom. But as Attorney Chen rose to address the jury, the side door to the courtroom creaked open. Every head turned as a magnificent German shepherd padded into the room, his movements deliberate and confident. The dog's coat was a rich blend of black and tan, his intelligent dark eyes scanning the faces before him. Between his teeth, he carried a crumpled piece of paper. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Judge Harrison's gavel froze midway to the bench as he stared at the unexpected visitor. The dog moved with purpose, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor, in a steady rhythm that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. He walked directly to the witness stand and sat down, his posture straight and alert, as if he had done this countless times before. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the dog immediately, though she hadn't seen him in over 3 years. Rex had been her constant companion through the most difficult period of her life, trained not just as a pet, but as a working dog with specialized skills that few people in Millbrook knew about. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched, him knowing that his appearance here now could only mean one thing. "Your Honor," Attorney Chen stammered, clearly thrown off his prepared remarks. I'm not sure what to make of this situation." Richard Blackwood maintained his composed demeanor, though those sitting close enough might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. He had built his reputation on controlling narratives, on anticipating problems before they arose. An untrained animal disrupting legal proceedings was exactly the kind of chaos he despised, but he forced his expression to remain neutral, even slightly amused. "Judge," Harrison set down his gavel and leaned forward in his chair. "Bailiff, please remove the animal from the courtroom." But as Bailiff Murphy approached, Rex remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the judge with an almost human intelligence. The note in his mouth was clearly visible now, its edges worn and stained with age. Several jury members leaned forward in their seats, curiosity overcoming their initial surprise. "Wait," called out a voice from the gallery. Jake Miller, the veteran reporter from the Millbrook Gazette, stood up from his seat in the back row. At 48, Jake had covered every significant story in the county for over 2 decades, and his instincts told him this was more than just a stray dog wandering into the wrong building. "Your Honor, perhaps we should see what the dog is carrying." A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison frowned, clearly outside the bounds of normal courtroom procedure, but the interest from the gallery and jury was unmistakable. "Mr. Miller, this is highly irregular. I understand, Your Honor, but given the unusual circumstances, it might be worth investigating before we simply dismiss what could be evidence." Maggie felt her palms grow damp with perspiration. She wanted to stand up, to call Rex away, to end this before it went any further. But her legs felt rooted to the floor, and her voice seemed to have deserted her entirely. She could only watch as the drama unfolded, knowing that the piece of paper in Rex's mouth might contain information she had hoped would stay buried forever. Richard Blackwood's lawyer, Patricia Wells, rose from her seat. "Your Honor, I object to this entire spectacle. We have no idea where this animal came from or what it might be carrying. This is a court of law, not a circus." But before Judge Harrison could respond, Rex stood up and walked directly to the court reporter's desk, dropping the note beside her typewriter before returning to his position by the witness stand. The action was so deliberate, so clearly intentional, that it sent another wave of whispers through the courtroom. Judge Harrison studied the scene before him, weighing his options. In 30 years on the bench, he had never encountered anything quite like this. Protocol demanded that he clear the courtroom and continue with the scheduled proceedings. But the attention of everyone present was now focused entirely on that crumpled piece of paper. "Bailiff Murphy, please retrieve the document and bring it to me," he finally decided. As the bailiff carefully picked up the note, Maggie closed her eyes and said a silent prayer. She had spent 3 years believing that chapter of her life was closed, that the truth would remain safely hidden in the past where it belonged. Now, as she watched Judge Harrison unfold the aged paper, she realized that sometimes the past has a way of finding its way back to the surface, no matter how deeply it's been buried. Rex remained motionless by the witness stand, his dark eyes now fixed on Maggie with an expression that seemed almost knowing. Around the courtroom, the tension was palpable as everyone waited to see what secrets that small piece of paper might reveal. Judge Harrison's fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the yellowed piece of paper. The courtroom fell into a silence, so complete that the ticking of the wall clock seemed to echo like a metronome. He adjusted his reading glasses and studied the handwritten text, his expression growing more perplexed with each passing second. "The handwriting appears to be quite old," he announced, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "The ink has faded, and the paper shows significant age." He paused, reading silently before continuing. "It appears to be a note that says, The truth about Riverside Development must be told. Check the basement files at Thompson's store. Elizabeth knew everything. RB cannot hide forever. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Several heads turned toward Richard Blackwood, whose initials clearly matched those mentioned in the note. For the first time since the proceedings began, his composed facade showed the slightest crack, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. Maggie's world seemed to tilt on its axis. Elizabeth. The note mentioned Elizabeth. After all these years, after all her efforts to let sleeping dogs lie, her sister's name was being spoken aloud in this courtroom. Elizabeth Thompson had been gone for 5 years now, having moved to California to care for their aging aunt, but her presence had always loomed large in Millbrook's collective memory. Attorney Chen cleared his throat, clearly struggling to regain control of his case. Your Honor, while this is certainly unexpected, I'm not sure how a random note brought in by a stray dog relates to our property dispute. I object to the characterization of this as a random note, Patricia Wells interjected, rising from her seat. We have no idea how old this document is, who wrote it, or where it came from. For all we know, it could have been planted here deliberately to disrupt these proceedings. Jake Miller scribbled furiously in his notebook, his journalistic instincts in overdrive. Riverside Development rang a bell in his memory, something from years ago that he couldn't quite place. He made a mental note to dig through his archives as soon as court recessed. Judge Harrison set the note aside and looked out over the courtroom. Given the unusual circumstances, I'm going to call a 30-minute recess to allow all parties to collect themselves. When we reconvene, we'll continue with the scheduled proceedings unless there are compelling reasons to do otherwise. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in animated conversation. Rex remained seated by the witness stand, seemingly unbothered by the commotion around him. Maggie gathered her purse with shaking hands, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom. But as she reached the aisle, she found her path blocked by Jake Miller. Mrs. Thompson, he said gently, his reporter's badge visible on his jacket. I don't mean to intrude, but I couldn't help noticing that the dog seemed to recognize you. Maggie's throat felt dry as sandpaper. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mr. Miller. It's just that he's been watching you throughout the proceedings, and when I saw how you reacted when the note mentioned Thompson's store, well, I put 2 and 2 together. Jake's voice was kind but persistent. That's your family's old general store downtown, isn't it? The one that's been closed since your sister moved away? Before Maggie could respond, Richard Blackwood appeared at her elbow, his politician's smile firmly in place. Mrs. Thompson, what an unexpected morning this has been. I hope you're not too shaken by all this drama. The irony wasn't lost on Maggie that Richard would position himself as her protector in this moment. She had known him since he was a young man, fresh out of college, full of ambition and charm. He had courted Elizabeth briefly in those early days, before his business interests took precedence over personal relationships. I'm fine, thank you, Richard, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Good, good. Richard's eyes flicked toward Jake Miller, a silent warning in his gaze. I'm sure this whole business with the dog will be cleared up quickly, probably just someone's idea of a prank. But Jake wasn't so easily dismissed. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, I was hoping to ask you about Riverside Development. The name sounds familiar, but I can't quite place it. Richard's smile never wavered, but Maggie caught the flash of something cold in his eyes. I'm afraid I develop properties all over the state, Mr. Miller. Without more specifics, I couldn't possibly help you. Of course, Jake replied, making another note. Well, I'm sure it will come to me. As the two men engaged in their verbal sparring, Maggie slipped away toward the exit. But Rex had other plans. The German shepherd rose from his position and followed her, his presence both comforting and terrifying. She had trained him herself years ago when Elizabeth first started expressing concerns about certain business dealings in town. Rex had been taught to find and retrieve specific documents, a skill that had proven invaluable during those troubled months before Elizabeth decided to leave Millbrook for good. In the courthouse hallway, Maggie found a quiet corner and knelt down to Rex's level. The dog approached her cautiously, as if uncertain of his welcome after so many years apart. When she reached out to stroke his head, he leaned into her touch, and for a moment she was transported back to the days when he had been her constant companion and closest confidant. "What are you doing here, boy?" she whispered. "Who sent you?" Rex tilted his head, studying her with those intelligent dark eyes. Then, to her amazement, he turned and walked toward the staircase that led to the courthouse basement. He paused at the top of the stairs, looking back at her with an expression that clearly said, "Follow me." Maggie glanced around the hallway. Most people were still in the courtroom or had stepped outside for fresh air. The basement housed old court records and storage rooms that few people ever visited. Against her better judgment, she found herself following Rex down the narrow staircase. The basement was dimly lit and smelled of old paper and dust. Rex moved confidently through the maze of filing cabinets and storage boxes as if he had been here before. He stopped in front of a particular section of files and sat down, his tail wagging slightly. With trembling hands, Maggie pulled out the drawer Rex had indicated. Inside were files dating back 15 years, including several thick folders labeled Riverside Development Project. Her heart sank as she realized what Rex had led her to discover. Elizabeth had hidden copies of everything down here, insurance against the day when the truth might need to come to light. Bank statements, contracts, correspondence, and photographs were all meticulously organized and preserved. At the bottom of the stack was an envelope marked with Elizabeth's handwriting. "For Maggie, when the time comes." As Maggie opened the envelope, she heard footsteps on the stairs above. Someone was coming down to the basement, and she had a sinking feeling that her time was running out. Rex's ears perked up, and he moved protectively closer to her side, as if sensing danger approaching. The footsteps grew closer, echoing off the concrete walls. Maggie quickly stuffed the envelope into her purse and tried to close the file drawer. Quietly, but the old metal tracks squealed in protest. Rex stood up, his body tense and alert, positioned between Maggie and whoever was descending the stairs. A shadow appeared at the bottom of the staircase, and Maggie held her breath, praying that her presence in the basement could somehow be explained as innocent curiosity rather than what it really was. A desperate attempt to understand what Rex was trying to tell her, and why, after all these years, the past was refusing to stay buried. Jake Miller's head appeared at the bottom of the staircase, his expression shifting from curiosity to surprise when he spotted Maggie crouched beside the filing cabinets. Rex remained positioned protectively between them, though his stance relaxed slightly when he recognized the journalist. "Mrs. Thompson," Jake said softly, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm sorry if I startled you. I saw you come down here and thought you might need help." Maggie's heart was still racing, but she could see the genuine concern in Jake's eyes. She had known him for years, had watched him grow from an eager young reporter into a respected journalist who took his role as the community's truth-teller seriously. If anyone could be trusted with what she was beginning to understand, it might be him. "I'm not sure I know what I'm doing down here," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake glanced around the dusty basement, taking in the rows of filing cabinets and storage boxes. This is where they keep the old court records, isn't it? Going back 20, 30 years. Yes, Maggie confirmed, then hesitated before continuing. Mr. Miller, what do you remember about Riverside Development? Jake's eyes sharpened with interest. That's what I've been trying to recall ever since the note was read upstairs. I know I've heard that name before, but it's been nagging at me. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through some notes. I've been doing some quick research and I found a reference in one of my old articles from about 15 years ago. It was a proposed development project that was supposed to transform the riverfront area downtown. What happened to it? Maggie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. That's the strange thing. The project just seemed to disappear from public discussion. One day, it was the talk of the town, with big promises about bringing jobs and tourism to Millbrook, and then suddenly nobody was talking about it anymore. Jake looked at the file drawer that Maggie had been examining. I don't suppose those files might have some answers. Maggie glanced down at Rex, who was sitting calmly beside her, his dark eyes moving between her and Jake, as if he was following their conversation. The dog had led her here for a reason, and perhaps it was time to stop running from whatever truth Elizabeth had tried to preserve. My sister Elizabeth was involved in the early planning stages of Riverside Development, Maggie said slowly. She worked as an administrative assistant for the city planning office back then, and she had access to a lot of documents. I remember Elizabeth, Jake said with a fond smile. She was always meticulous about keeping records. If anyone would have kept proper documentation of a project like that, it would be her. Maggie pulled the envelope from her purse, Elizabeth's familiar handwriting clear on the front. She left this for me. I think she knew that someday I might need to understand what really happened. Jake watched respectfully as Maggie opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were several documents and a letter written in Elizabeth's neat script. Maggie scanned the letter quickly, her face growing pale as she read. "What does it say?" Jake asked gently. Maggie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. Elizabeth says that Riverside Development was never really about improving Millbrook. It was a scheme to buy up riverfront properties at below-market prices and then abandon the development, leaving the original property owners with worthless land, while the development company profited from selling the properties to a different buyer at much higher prices. Jake whistled low under his breath. That's a serious accusation. Did she have proof? Maggie held up several documents from the envelope. Bank records, correspondence between Richard Blackwood and several shell companies, and contracts that show the true intentions behind the project. She paused, her voice growing stronger. Richard wasn't just involved in Riverside Development, Mr. Miller. He was the mastermind behind it. But why did Elizabeth never come forward with this information? Jake asked. Because Richard threatened her, Maggie replied, her voice tight with old anger. When Elizabeth started asking questions about the project, he made it clear that her continued employment and her family's reputation in this town depended on her silence. She was a single woman trying to support herself and help me care for our elderly parents. She couldn't afford to lose her job. Jake was already taking notes, his reporter's instincts fully engaged. So she kept copies of everything as insurance and trained Rex to help her hide and retrieve important documents, Maggie added, looking down at the German shepherd who was watching their conversation with alert interest. Elizabeth always said that if something happened to her, Rex would know what to do. But Elizabeth moved to California 5 years ago, Jake pointed out. She's still alive, isn't she? Maggie nodded. She is, but she's been caring for our aunt who has dementia. Elizabeth couldn't leave her to come back here, even if she wanted to. She paused, studying the documents in her hands. I think someone else must have sent Rex back here. someone who knew about Elizabeth's insurance policy and decided it was time for the truth to come out. Before Jake could respond, they heard voices from the staircase above. Richard Blackwood's smooth baritone carried clearly down to the basement, along with what sounded like Patricia Wells's voice. "They must be down there somewhere," Richard was saying. "The bailiff said he saw Mrs. Thompson head toward the basement." Rex immediately stood up, his ears alert and his body tense. Maggie quickly stuffed the documents back into her purse, while Jake helped her to her feet. "Is there another way out of here?" Jake whispered. Maggie shook her head. "Only the main staircase." "Then we'll have to face them," Jake said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "But Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that you're not alone in this anymore. Whatever happened 15 years ago, whatever Elizabeth discovered, it deserves to see the light of day." As Richard's footsteps grew louder on the stairs, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. For too long, she had carried the burden of Elizabeth's secrets, watching Richard Blackwood continue to prosper while knowing the truth about his character. Now, with Jake beside her and Rex at her side, she realized that the truth had a way of finding allies when it needed them most. "Mrs. Thompson," Richard's voice called out as he reached the bottom of the stairs, his tone friendly but with an undertone of concern. "I hope you're all right. We were worried when you disappeared." Maggie straightened her shoulders and stepped out from behind the filing cabinets, Rex moving protectively beside her. "I'm fine, Richard. Just doing a little research." Richard's eyes immediately went to the German Shepherd, and Maggie caught a flicker of recognition in his gaze. "That's an interesting dog. Does he belong to you?" "He used to," Maggie replied carefully. "He belonged to my sister, Elizabeth." "Elizabeth," Richard repeated, his smile never wavering even as something cold passed through his eyes. "How is your sister doing in California? I always regretted that she felt the need to leave Millbrook so suddenly." Jake stepped forward, his notebook visible in his hand. "Mr. Blackwood, I was hoping we could schedule an interview about Riverside Development. I'm working on a retrospective piece about major development projects in the county over the past 20 years. Richard's politician's smile remained fixed, but Maggie could see the calculation going on behind his eyes. "I'd be happy to help, Mr. Miller, though I'm not sure how much I remember about projects from that long ago. Perhaps we could arrange something after the current court proceedings are concluded." "Of course," Jake agreed amicably. "Though I have to say, it's fascinating how these old stories have a way of coming back to life, isn't it? Sometimes the most interesting details are preserved in the most unexpected places." As the four of them stood in the dusty basement, with Rex alert and watchful between them, Maggie realized that the battle lines were being drawn. On one side stood truth and justice, represented by the evidence Elizabeth had carefully preserved and the allies who were willing to help bring it to light. On the other side stood wealth and influence, backed by years of carefully constructed lies and the power to silence those who dared to speak against it. But as Rex looked up at her with those intelligent dark eyes, Maggie remembered Elizabeth's words from so many years ago. "The truth has a way of surviving, even when everything else falls apart. We just have to be brave enough to trust it." When court reconvened 30 minutes later, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Word of the mysterious note had spread through Millbrook's tight-knit community like wildfire, and the gallery was now packed with faces that hadn't been there earlier. Local business owners, retired teachers, and longtime residents filled every available seat, their curiosity palpable. Judge Harrison called for order, but before he could resume the original proceedings, Rex once again entered through the side. Duh. This time, however, he moved with even greater purpose, carrying what appeared to be a less crumpled piece of paper in his mouth. The courtroom fell silent as the German Shepherd walked directly to the judge's bench and placed the document at Judge Harrison's feet before returning to his now familiar position near the witness stand. Maggie's heart hammered in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. From her seat, she could see Richard Blackwood's hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white with tension. Patricia Wells leaned over to whisper something in his ear, but he shook his head sharply, his attention fixed entirely on the piece of paper Judge Harrison was now examining. "This appears to be another handwritten note," Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment, "and it appears to be more recent than the first one." He cleared his throat and read aloud, "The Thompson family deserves to know what really happened to their property on River Street. Look for the blue folder in Elizabeth's hiding place. The signatures on the Riverside contracts were forged. MC." Dazas initials MC sent a ripple of whispers through the courtroom. Jake Miller, now seated in the front row with his notebook ready, immediately began scribbling. He recognized those initials, though it took him a moment to place them. MC could be Martha Carson, the retired city clerk who had worked alongside Elizabeth in the planning office all those years ago. Attorney Chen stood up, clearly struggling to understand how his straightforward property dispute had transformed into something much larger. "Your Honor, while these notes are certainly intriguing, I'm not sure how they relate to the current case before us." But before Judge Harrison could respond, an elderly woman in the back of the courtroom stood up slowly, leaning heavily on her. Walker, Martha Carson was 83 years old, her white hair neatly permed and her floral dress pressed to perfection. She had served the city of Millbrook for over 40 years before retiring, and her integrity was beyond question. "Your Honor," Martha said in a voice that still carried authority despite her age, "I believe I can provide some context for these notes." Judge Harrison looked surprised but gestured for her to continue. "Mrs. Carson, do you have information relevant to these proceedings?" "I do, Your Honor. I wrote that second note." Martha's admission sent a wave of surprise through the courtroom. "I've been waiting 15 years for the right moment to tell what I know about Riverside Development and what really happened to the Thompson family property." Richard Blackwood half rose from his seat, his face flushed. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mrs. Carson was not scheduled to testify, and these accusations are completely unfounded." But Martha Carson was not to be intimidated. "Mr. Blackwood, I kept quiet for 15 years because I was afraid. But I'm 83 years old now, and I've decided I'd rather face whatever consequences come from telling the truth than take my secrets to the grave." Judge Harrison considered the situation carefully. "Mrs. Carson, are you saying you have direct knowledge of fraud or misconduct related to the Riverside Development Project?" "I am, Your Honor. Elizabeth Thompson came to me in the summer of 2008, concerned about irregularities she had discovered in the property acquisition documents for Riverside Development. When she brought her concerns to the appropriate authorities, she was told to drop the matter or face consequences that would affect her livelihood and her family's reputation." Maggie felt tears stinging her eyes as Martha confirmed what she had read in Elizabeth's letter. For years, she had wondered if her sister had been paranoid or overly cautious. Now, she understood that Elizabeth had been trying to protect not just herself, but the entire Thompson family. Jake Miller raised his hand. "Your Honor, may I ask Mrs. Carson a question as a member of the press?" Judge Harrison nodded, though he looked as if he was navigating uncharted territory. "Proceed, Mr. Miller." "Mrs. Carson, you mentioned forged signatures on the Riverside contracts. Can you be more specific about what you witnessed?" Martha's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I saw Richard Blackwood forge the signature of Thomas Thompson, Maggie and Elizabeth's father, on a property transfer document. Thomas had dementia at the time and was in no condition to sign legal documents, but his signature appeared on papers that transferred the family's riverfront property. to Riverside Development for a fraction of its true value. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Thomas Thompson had been a beloved figure in Millbrook, a World War II veteran who had run the family general store for over 50 years. The idea that someone had taken advantage of his condition was deeply disturbing to everyone who had known him. Richard Blackwood stood up abruptly, his face red with anger. "This is preposterous. Mrs. Carson is elderly and clearly confused. I never forged anyone's signature, and I resent these baseless accusations." But Martha wasn't finished. Elizabeth made copies of everything before she was forced to leave town. She knew that someday the truth would need to come out. She trained that dog to find and retrieve the evidence she had hidden, and she taught Maggie how to handle him if the need ever arose. All eyes turned to Maggie, who felt the weight of the entire courtroom's attention. Rex, as if sensing her distress, walked over to her row and sat down beside her, his presence offering comfort and strength. Judge Harrison called for order as the noise level in the courtroom continued to rise. "Given the serious nature of these allegations, I'm ordering a recess until tomorrow morning. This will give all parties time to gather any relevant documentation and determine how to proceed." As the gavel fell, Maggie found herself surrounded by concerned neighbors and friends. But through the crowd, she could see Richard Blackwood in heated conversation with his lawyer, their expressions grave and urgent. She also noticed that Jake Miller was already on his phone, likely calling his editor to discuss the biggest story to hit Millbrook in decades. Rex remained close to her side as she made her way toward the exit. But before she could leave the courtroom, she felt a gentle hand on her arm. It was Martha Carson, her aged eyes bright with determination. "I should have spoken up years ago," Martha said quietly. "I was younger then, still working, still afraid of losing my pension, but Elizabeth was right to document everything, and you're right to let the truth come out now." "Mrs. Carson, are you sure you want to go through with this?" Maggie asked, concerned about the elderly woman's well-being. "Richard Blackwood is a powerful man with a lot of resources." Martha's smile was surprisingly fierce. "My dear, I've lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and the loss of 2 husbands. Richard Blackwood doesn't scare me anymore." She paused, glancing down at Rex. "Besides, it looks like we have some very determined allies on our side." As Maggie walked out of the courthouse with Rex at her side, she realized that what had started as a simple property dispute had evolved into something much more significant. The truth about Riverside Development was finally beginning to emerge, and with allies like Martha Carson and Jake Miller standing beside her, she began to believe that justice might actually be possible. But she also knew that Richard Blackwood wouldn't give up without a fight. A man who had spent 15 years building his reputation and wealth on a foundation of lies would not let that foundation crumble without doing everything in his power to protect it. The real battle was just beginning, and Maggie could only hope that she had the strength to see it through to the end. Behind her, the courthouse doors closed with a heavy thud, but Rex looked back once before following her down the steps, as if he knew they would be returning soon for the final confrontation that would determine whether truth or power would ultimately prevail in Millbrook. That evening, Maggie sat in her kitchen with Elizabeth's documents spread across the worn, wooden table. Rex lay beside her chair, his presence both comforting and motivating as she worked through years of carefully preserved evidence. The phone had been ringing constantly since word of the courthouse revelation spread through town, but she had let the answering machine handle the calls while she focused on understanding the full scope of what her sister had discovered. Jake Miller arrived at 8 o'clock, carrying a thick folder of his own research and a determined expression. Maggie had agreed to let him review Elizabeth's documents in preparation for the next day's proceedings, knowing that having an experienced journalist on her side could make all the difference. I've been digging through old newspaper archives and city records all afternoon, Jake said, as he settled into a chair across from her. The scope of this thing is bigger than I initially thought. Maggie looked up from a contract she had been studying. What do you mean? Riverside Development wasn't the only project Richard was involved in during that time period. I found records of at least 3 other development schemes between 2008 and 2012, all following a similar pattern. Jake opened his folder and pulled out several photocopied documents. Elderly property owners, promises of community improvement, properties purchased at below market prices, and then projects that either never materialized or were dramatically scaled back. How many families were affected? Maggie asked, though she dreaded the answer. At least a dozen, maybe more. The Hendersons lost their farm on the outskirts of town. The Martinez family's restaurant property was purchased for a shopping center that was never built. The pattern is unmistakable once you know what to look for. Rex suddenly lifted his head, his ears alert. A moment later, they heard a car pulling into Maggie's driveway. Through the kitchen window, they could see the headlights of an expensive sedan, and Maggie's heart sank as she recognized Richard Blackwood's vehicle. "He's coming here," she whispered, instinctively gathering the documents closer. Jake stood up, his protective instincts kicking in. "Do you want me to stay?" Before Maggie could answer, Rex was on his feet and moving toward the front door, his posture alert but not aggressive. The doorbell rang, followed by Richard's familiar voice calling out, "Maggie, I know you're home. We need to talk." Maggie took a deep breath and walked to the front door, Jake and Rex flanking her sides. When she opened it, Richard stood on her porch, his usual polished appearance slightly disheveled. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had been having as sleepless a night as she had. "Richard," she said coolly, "it's rather late for a social visit." "Maggie, please, can we talk privately?" His eyes flicked to Jake Miller, and she could see the frustration in his expression. "This situation has gotten out of hand, and I think we can resolve it without all this public spectacle." "I think Mr. Miller should stay," Maggie replied firmly. "After all, this story's going to come out one way or another. It might as well be accurate." Richard stepped into the living room uninvited, his demeanor shifting from pleading to commanding. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Maggie. These accusations could destroy everything I've worked for, everything I've built in this community." "That's exactly the point," Maggie said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "You built your success on lies and theft, Richard. You stole from my family, from the Hendersons, from the Martinez family, and who knows how many others. I provided opportunities," Richard shot back, his mask of civility beginning to slip. "I brought development and jobs to this town. So what if a few old properties changed hands in the process? That's how business works." Jake Miller stepped forward, his notebook in hand. "Mr. Blackwood, are you admitting that you falsified documents and defrauded property owners?" Richard's eyes flashed with anger. "I'm not admitting anything to you, Miller. You're a small-town journalist looking to make a name for yourself with sensational stories." "Actually," Jake replied calmly, "I'm a journalist who believes in truth and accountability. And the truth is that you forged signatures, manipulated elderly property owners, and profited from their misfortune." Rex had positioned himself between Richard and Maggie, his intelligent eyes never leaving the man who had caused so much pain to the people he had been trained to protect. Richard noticed the dog's attention, and his expression grew even darker. "That animal should have been put down years ago," Richard muttered. "Elizabeth always was too sentimental about keeping that beast around." "Rex isn't just a pet," Maggie said quietly. "He's evidence. Elizabeth trained him to find and retrieve documents that proved your crimes. Every time he brought back a piece of paper today, he was following his training, bringing justice to light." Richard laughed bitterly. Justice? Maggie, you're living in a fantasy world. Do you really think anyone is going to believe that a dog is some kind of detective? This whole thing is ridiculous. The documents speak for themselves, Jake interjected. Mrs. Thompson has bank records, forged contracts and correspondence that clearly show a pattern of fraud. Martha Carson's testimony confirms what the paperwork reveals. Martha Carson is a senile old woman, Richard snapped. Her testimony won't hold up under scrutiny. But the handwriting analysis will, Maggie said, pulling one of the contracts from the pile on her coffee table. Elizabeth had your signature authenticated by a professional analyst years ago. She was thorough, Richard. She knew that someday someone would try to claim the evidence was fabricated. For the first time since entering her home, Richard looked genuinely shaken, his eyes fixed on the document in Maggie's hands, and she could see him calculating his options. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice resigned. "I want you to confess," Maggie replied without hesitation. "I want you to admit what you did and make restitution to all the families you cheated. And I want you to publicly apologize for forcing Elizabeth to leave her home and her community." Richard's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You're asking me to destroy myself to satisfy your need for revenge." "I'm asking you to do the right thing," Maggie corrected. "For once in your life, choose honesty over profit." "And if I refuse?" Jake. Miller looked up from his notes. "Then we go to court tomorrow with everything we have, and I publish a complete investigation in the Gazette. Either way, the truth comes out, Mr. Blackwood. The only question is whether you want to have any control over how the story is told." Richard was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Maggie to Jake to Rex, who continued to watch him with unwavering attention. Finally, he straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Maggie. "You have no idea what you're unleashing," he said quietly. "There are people involved in this who won't be as understanding as I've been. People with more to lose and fewer scruples about how they protect their interests." "Are you threatening me?" Maggie asked, her voice steady despite the chill that ran down her spine. "I'm warning you," Richard replied. "Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, pausing only to look back at Rex one final time. "You should keep that dog close, Maggie. You never know who might decide he's become a liability." After Richard left, Maggie sank into her chair, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. Jake immediately moved to check the locks on her doors and windows, his protective instincts fully engaged. "We need to make sure you're safe tonight," he said. "And tomorrow, we need to make sure all of this evidence gets into the right hands before anyone tries to make it disappear." Rex came over to Maggie's chair and rested his head on her lap, his dark eyes looking up at her with an expression that seemed to say, "We've come this far together. We can see it through to the end." As Maggie stroked his fur, she thought about Elizabeth, thousands of miles away in California, probably sleeping peacefully with no idea that the carefully laid plans she had made years ago were finally coming to fruition. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when truth and power would face off in a courtroom filled with people who deserved to know what had really happened to their community. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in 15 years, Maggie believed that justice might actually be possible. The next morning, the courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread throughout Millbrook and the surrounding counties about the dramatic revelations, and people arrived hours early to secure seats in the gallery. Local television crews from Indianapolis had even made the drive to cover what was being called the biggest scandal in the county's recent history. Maggie arrived with Jake Miller, carrying a briefcase full of Elizabeth's carefully preserved evidence. Rex walked beside them, his presence drawing attention from the growing crowd of onlookers. As they climbed the courthouse steps, Maggie was amazed to see familiar faces offering words of support. Mrs. Henderson, whose family had lost their farm, squeezed her hand and whispered, "Thank you for having the courage to speak up." Carlos Martinez, the restaurant owner whose property had been taken years ago, nodded respectfully as they passed. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Judge Harrison had called for an extraordinary session to address the new evidence that had emerged, and he looked both determined and concerned as he took his position at the bench. Richard Blackwood sat at the defendant's table with Patricia Wells, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a grim tension that was visible to everyone in the room. "Before we proceed," Judge Harrison announced, "I want to make clear that we are no longer dealing solely with the original property dispute. Based on the evidence that has come to light, I have requested that the State Attorney General's office send a representative to observe these proceedings." A man in a dark suit rose from the front row and identified himself as Assistant Attorney General David Chen, no relation to the local attorney. His presence sent a clear message that the state was taking these allegations seriously. Martha Carson was called as the first witness. Despite her age, she walked to the witness stand with dignity and purpose, her voice clear and strong as she was sworn in. Under oath, she detailed everything she had witnessed during her years working in the city planning office, including the specific instance when she saw Richard Blackwood forge Thomas Thompson's signature. "Mr. Blackwood came to the office after hours," Martha testified. "He said he had permission to pick up some documents that needed to be filed. I was working late, finishing up some paperwork, when I saw him at Thomas Thompson's file. He had a document spread out on the desk and was carefully copying Mr. Thompson's signature from an older form onto a new property transfer document." Patricia Wells cross-examined Martha aggressively, trying to suggest that her memory might be faulty due to her age, but Martha's responses were sharp and detailed, clearly, demonstrating that her mind was as sharp as ever. Next, Jake Miller was called to present his investigative findings. He had worked through the night to compile a comprehensive report showing the pattern of fraudulent activities across multiple development projects. His testimony revealed that at least 15 families had been affected, with combined losses totaling over $2 million. The evidence shows a systematic approach to targeting elderly property owners and those in financial distress, Jake testified. In each case, properties were acquired at significantly below market prices through various forms of misrepresentation, and the promised development projects either never materialized or were dramatically scaled back. When Maggie was called to testify, Rex remained at her side, having been officially recognized by the court as a trained document recovery animal. With Elizabeth's written permission, obtained by phone the night before, Maggie presented the entire collection of evidence her sister had preserved. Elizabeth knew she was taking a risk by documenting these activities, Maggie testified, her voice growing stronger with each word. But she also knew that someday the truth would need to come out. She trained Rex not just to find documents, but to bring them to people who would act on the information responsibly. The most dramatic moment came when Richard Blackwood took the stand in his own defense. He attempted to maintain his innocence, claiming that all property acquisitions had been legitimate business transactions, and that any irregularities were the result of clerical errors or misunderstandings. But as he spoke, Rex suddenly stood up from his position beside Maggie's chair and walked to the witness stand. The German Shepherd sat down directly in front of Richard, his dark eyes fixed on the man with an intensity that seemed to unnerve him. Richard's testimony began to falter, his confident demeanor cracking under the weight of Rex's unwavering stare and the evidence that continued to mount against him. "Mr. Blackwood," the Assistant Attorney General interjected during cross-examination, We have handwriting analysis confirming that you forged at least 6 signatures on property transfer documents. We have bank records showing that you profited from reselling properties that were acquired through fraudulent means. How do you explain these facts? Richard's composure finally broke completely. You don't understand the pressure I was under, he said, his voice cracking. The economy was collapsing, my investors were demanding returns, and I had obligations to meet. These were business decisions, not personal attacks. So you admit to forging signatures and defrauding property owners? The prosecutor pressed. Richard looked out over the courtroom, seeing the faces of people he had lived among for decades, people whose trust he had betrayed. His shoulders sagged in defeat. Yes, he whispered. Yes, I did those things. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Harrison called for order, but the emotional release was palpable. Families who had suffered in silence for years finally had their vindication, but the biggest surprise was yet to come. As the proceedings continued, a new witness entered the courtroom, causing a stir of recognition among the gallery. Elizabeth Thompson walked down the aisle, her silver hair neatly styled and her expression determined. She had flown in from California overnight, leaving her aunt in the care of professional nurses so she could be present for the conclusion of the battle she had started years ago. I'm sorry I couldn't be here sooner, Elizabeth said as she was sworn in, but I had to see this through to the end. Elizabeth's testimony was the final piece of the puzzle. She detailed not only Richard's fraudulent activities, but also the intimidation tactics he had used to silence her. She revealed that she had left Millbrook not just to care for their aunt, but because Richard had threatened to destroy her reputation and her family's standing in the community if she continued to pursue the truth. I trained Rex to be my insurance policy, Elizabeth explained, reaching down to pet the German shepherd who had moved to sit beside the witness stand. I knew that if something happened to me, or if the time was right for the truth to come out, Rex would know what to do and who to trust. When Elizabeth finished her testimony, she looked directly at Richard, who sat with his head in his hands. I never wanted to destroy you, Richard, she said quietly. I just wanted you to do the right thing. It's not too late to start making amends. Judge Harrison called for a recess to allow all parties to consider the overwhelming evidence that had been presented. When court reconvened, Richard Blackwood stood before the judge, flanked by his attorney but looking completely defeated. Your Honor, Richard said, his voice barely audible, I would like to change my plea to guilty on all charges. I also want to make a public apology to all the families I wronged, and I'm prepared to make full restitution for all damages caused by my actions. The courtroom remained silent as Richard turned to face the gallery. I have spent 15 years living with the knowledge of what I did, watching good people suffer because of my greed and cowardice. I cannot undo the pain I've caused, but I can try to make it right from this day forward. As Richard was led away to await sentencing, Maggie felt a hand slip into hers. Elizabeth stood beside her, tears streaming down both their faces as they watched justice finally being served. Rex sat between them, his tail wagging slightly, as if he understood that his mission had been accomplished. The aftermath of the trial brought dramatic changes to Millbrook. Richard's business empire was dismantled, with assets liquidated to provide restitution to his victims. The Thompson family's riverfront property was returned to them, along with compensation for 15 years of lost income. Other families received similar settlements, allowing them to rebuild their lives and restore their faith in the justice system. Jake Miller's investigative reporting earned him recognition from the State Journalism Association and led to a position with a major Indianapolis newspaper. But he chose to stay in Millbrook, where he continued to serve as the community's watchdog, ensuring that the truth would always have a voice. Elizabeth decided to return to Millbrook permanently, opening a small consulting firm that helped families navigate legal and financial challenges. She and Maggie renovated the old general store, turning it into a community resource center where people could get help with everything from property disputes to elder care. Rex, now recognized as a local hero, split his time between the Thompson sisters, though he seemed to understand that his most important work was done. He had brought truth to light and justice to his community, proving that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who never give up, no matter how long it takes. As the seasons changed and Millbrook began to heal from the wounds of deception and betrayal, the story of the German shepherd who brought justice to a small town became legendary. Parents told their children about the importance of truth and persistence, using Rex as an example of how loyalty and determination could overcome even the most powerful forces of corruption. And on quiet evenings, when the courthouse square was empty, except for the gentle glow of streetlights, Rex could sometimes be seen sitting on the courthouse steps, his dark eyes alert and watchful, as if he knew that the truth needed constant guardians to ensure it would never again be buried. In darkness, dear listeners, we hope that Maggie and Elizabeth's story of courage and justice has touched your hearts. Just like Rex never gave up on bringing the truth to light, we never give up on bringing you stories that matter. If this tale of perseverance and family loyalty resonated with you, we have prepared a special playlist filled with equally captivating stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. You can find it by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of human nature and the power of truth. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey.